All right, let's dive into a really fascinating question, one that kind of blurs the line between ancient history and, well, science fiction.
What if ancient texts, I mean really ancient texts, describe things like flying machines, superweapons, and forbidden knowledge that just sounds, well, eerily familiar to us today?
But that brings up the big question, right? Are we looking at actual echoes of some lost, super advanced past? Or are we just, projecting our own modern ideas about tech and war onto the poetry and symbols of our ancestors?
So, first up, let's take a look at the actual passages that get these theories started. These are the ancient words that really make you stop and go, hmm.
Let's start with a really famous one from the Book of Ezekiel. Now, this was written over 2,500 years ago, and the prophet talks about a huge cloud with flashing fire and this gleaming thing right in the middle. Now, if you're a fan of ancient astronaut theories, you'd say, hey, that's not a mystical vision, that's a spot-on description of a high-tech spacecraft coming down from the sky. And believe me, this isn't a one-off thing. If you look at ancient Indian epics, they're filled with talk about vimanas, these flying palaces or chariots. And some of these descriptions, they go way beyond just poetry. They get into details about propulsion systems and what these things could do, with so much seeming precision that modern engineers have actually tried to sketch them out, just like in this diagram.
And it's not just about flying, either. The Mahabharata, an epic that's thousands of years old, talks about a weapon that unleashes this blast, a blast brighter than 1,000 suns. The description of what happens next is just chilling. It says survivors lose their hair, their fingernails, that the food gets poisoned. I mean, come on, to anyone reading that today, it sounds exactly like an atomic bomb and the radioactive fallout that comes after.
Okay, but hold on. Reading these things like they're literal instruction manuals might be missing the whole point. To really get what's going on here, we kind of have to shift our thinking and look at how ancient people thought about knowledge, and even prophecy itself. This quote really nails a key idea. See, for ancient thinkers, prophecy wasn't necessarily magic. It was more like pattern recognition on a massive scale. They saw cycles everywhere, in nature, in societies, in how people behave. They figured, hey, if the universe has rules, then history probably does too. So what we might call a prophecy could actually be their version of long-range forecasting. It's like a message from the past saying, listen up, we've seen this movie before and we know how it ends. And this whole idea of interpretation is so important when we look at something like the Book of Enoch. It's this ancient Jewish text, not part of the standard Bible, and it tells a wild story about fallen angels called Watchers. They come down to Earth and teach humanity all this forbidden knowledge. How to make weapons, work with metals, even makeup and sorcery. At first glance, it sounds exactly like a massive, sudden tech dump from a more advanced civilization. But this is where it gets interesting. You can read that story in two totally different ways. The literal reading, yeah, supernatural beings gave early humans a tech upgrade. But there's a symbolic reading, which a lot of scholars lean towards. They see it as a powerful warning against adopting foreign cultures. That forbidden knowledge might not have been alien tech at all, but the military tactics and customs of their powerful neighbors, like the Greeks. So the whole story becomes a warning. Don't lose who you are by trying to be like them. Okay, so now that we have this tool, this idea of symbolic reading, let's circle back to those first claims and take a much closer look at the evidence. Let's start with the Vimana. Sure, it can mean a flying machine for the gods, but the original Sanskrit word, it's a lot more complicated than that. It can also mean a palace or a temple tower. It can even be used as a metaphor for a person who's given up their ego. The bottom line is, the word itself doesn't just automatically translate to spaceship. And this is really the critical difference, isn't it? For all the beautiful, poetic descriptions of the manas, we have found zero, and I mean zero, archaeological evidence for them. Now contrast that with something like the Huolong Chushui from Ming Dynasty China. That was a real, documented, honest-to-goodness multi-stage rocket. So yeah, ancient people were absolutely brilliant, but there's a big, clear line between an epic story and an engineering schematic. All right, what about that supposed atomic blast at Mohenjo-Daro? The proponents will point to rocks that were melted into a glass-like substance and skeletons that they claim are radioactive. But when actual archaeologists take a closer look, the story starts to fall apart. For one, there is no blast crater, no epicenter, and you've got these fragile mud brick walls still standing, which would be impossible in a nuclear blast. And those skeletons? Turns out they look more like a messy mass grave from different times, not a single instantaneous event. So the proof, well, it's shaky at best. So this leads to a much deeper question. If the hard physical evidence is so weak, why are these ideas so darn popular? Why do they stick around? What is it about this stuff that we find so captivating?
I mean, really think about it for a second. Why do we want to believe in ancient high tech? The answer probably has a lot more to do with us right here, right now, than it does with what actually happened thousands of years ago. Believing in this stuff does a few things for us psychologically. For some, it validates their spiritual beliefs. In a world that feels like it's all been explored and explained, this brings back a sense of real mystery. It makes the distant past feel connected to us right now. And it taps into that powerful myth of a lost golden age. That idea that maybe we aren't the peak of civilization, that maybe we're just finding things that our ancestors already knew. And this could be the real reason these stories are so tough. Think about it. When a civilization falls, the buildings crumble, the tools rust away. But stories, myths, prophecies, they're different. They're weightless. They're these little packages of knowledge, light enough to be carried from one generation to the next, when everything else is gone. So maybe we should stop looking at these texts as blueprints for machines that never existed. Maybe we should see them for what they are, encoded messages from our ancestors. They're talking about the human condition, warning us about power, thinking about how history just keeps repeating itself. It's their way of saying, hey, we've been here before. Watch your step. So, in the end, maybe the question isn't, did they build it? Maybe we've been asking the wrong thing all along. The real puzzle might not be about ancient spaceships or atom bombs. The real mystery is why we, with all our modern technology, are so desperate to look into the past and see ourselves